All right, so you're back with us, ready for another deep dive. Today we're looking at something pretty intriguing, something that might make you rethink how you view your heart health.
It definitely made me reconsider a few things.
I bet. We're talking about the link between, well, how well you can hear and your risk of developing heart failure.
Seems a bit out there at first, right?
For sure, for sure. But stick with us.
The research here is actually quite compelling.
Absolutely. We're digging into a large, long-term study out of the UK Biobank. They followed over 164,000 people for a median of almost 12 years.
A really robust data set to work with.
Absolutely. And what makes this study unique is its use of, well, really precise, objective measurements of hearing ability.
Yeah, they didn't just ask people, how's your hearing? They used a specific test called the Digit Triplets Test.
So this test, it measures how well people can understand speech, but not just any speech. Speech when there's a lot of background noise going on.
Like trying to follow a conversation at a bustling restaurant.
Exactly, exactly. So the big question we're tackling is there really a connection between how well someone can hear, particularly in those noisy situations, and their chances of ending up with heart failure? And if there is, what might be driving that connection?
Well, let's start with that first question. Is there a connection? The study found that there is, pretty definitively.
No kidding, huh?
Nope. They saw that the harder it was for someone to pick out speech in noise, the greater their risk of heart failure turned out to be.
So the worse you're hearing in those specific noisy situations, the higher your risk of heart failure. That's pretty straightforward.
It is, and to put some numbers to it, for every standard deviation increase in what's called the speech reception threshold, basically a measure of how much louder speech needs to be for someone to understand it, compared to background noise, the risk of heart failure went up by 5%.
So even a small decline in your ability to hear clearly amidst a lot of noise seems to nudge up your risk. And the researchers took it a step further. They didn't just look at that continuous measure. They also grouped people based on their hearing ability.
Yeah, they had categories like insufficient hearing and poor hearing, depending on how well people did on that speech and noise test.
So what did they find when they compared those groups to people with, what we consider normal hearing?
Well, folks with what they classified as insufficient hearing, meaning their speech reception threshold was between -5.5 and -3.5 decibels. And keep in mind, 0 decibels is like a really faint sound. Those individuals had a 15% higher risk of heart failure compared to those with normal hearing.
So already a noticeable jump in risk.
Right, and for those with poor hearing, where their threshold was greater than -3.5 decibels, so they needed speech to be even louder to understand it, they had a 28% higher risk of heart failure.
Wow, that is a substantial increase. And it makes you wonder, is this purely about the mechanics of hearing, or is there something more going on?
That's a great question, and the researchers dug into that too.
Because, they also looked at folks who were already using hearing aids. And you'd think that if it was just about the physical act of hearing, those folks would be, protected. The risk wouldn't be elevated.
Exactly. But that's not what they found. Participants who used hearing aids still had a 26% higher risk of heart failure compared to those with normal hearing.
So clearly there's something else going on, something beyond just the ears themselves. And that's where the researchers started to explore the role of, well, psychological factors.
Yeah, they looked at things like feelings of social isolation, levels of psychological distress, and even personality traits like neuroticism.
Those tendencies to worry or experience negative emotions more easily.
Exactly. And what they found is pretty fascinating. Psychological distress measured using a standardized questionnaire turned out to be a pretty significant player.
Like feeling anxious or down or just not emotionally well.
Right, so this psychological distress, it seemed to account for almost 17% of the link between having trouble hearing speech in noise and a higher risk of heart failure.
So almost a fifth of that connection can be explained by how people were feeling emotionally. That's pretty substantial.
It is. Social isolation and neuroticism also played a role, but much smaller, each mediating about 3% of the association.
Still, it paints a picture where struggling to hear, especially in social situations, might lead to feelings of isolation, stress, anxiety, and those feelings in turn could be affecting heart health.
It's like a cascade effect.
And did they find any particular groups of people where this connection between hearing and heart failure was even stronger?
Yes, actually. The association was more pronounced in folks who didn't have a history of coronary heart disease or stroke when the study began.
So people without pre-existing heart issues.
Right, which suggests that For those individuals, the impact of hearing difficulties on heart health might be even more significant.
Really interesting. So we've got this statistical link, we've got this potential psychological pathway. Did the researchers offer any thoughts on the biological reasons why hearing and heart health might be so interconnected?
They did. They pointed to the fact that the inner ear, it relies on a very delicate network of blood vessels. And it's also very metabolically active, meaning it needs a constant supply of oxygen and nutrients.
So it's kind of a sensitive system.
Very much so. And the researchers suggested that if there are problems with those tiny blood vessels in the ear, that might be an early sign of similar problems happening in the larger circulatory system, the system that feeds the heart.
So hearing impairment, in a way, could be a canary in the coal mine for broader cardiovascular issues. It's a fascinating idea. But of course, we always have to be mindful of limitations when we're talking about research.
For sure. Like any study, this one has its caveats.
So what were some of the things we need to keep in mind?
Well, first and foremost, it was an observational study, so it can show us that these things are linked, but it can't definitively prove that one causes the other. It could be that some other factor, something we haven't even thought of, is influencing both hearing and heart health.
Right, correlation doesn't equal causation.
Exactly. And another limitation is that they only measured hearing at the very beginning of the study. So any changes in someone's hearing over those 12 years, they weren't accounted for.
It's possible someone's hearing got worse over time, and that could be influencing the results.
Right. And finally, the study population, it was largely of European descent, and they were generally healthier than the average UK population.
So it's possible these findings might not apply equally to other groups of people.
Exactly.
Important caveats to keep in mind. But still, the findings are pretty thought-provoking. So let's recap what we've uncovered in this deep dive. This large study from the UK Biobank showed us that there is a significant association between how well someone can hear speech in noisy environments and their risk of developing heart failure. And this link seems to be at least partly driven by psychological factors, things like feelings of isolation and distress that can arise from struggling to hear.
And this research really highlights the intricate connections between our physical health and our mental well-being, especially when it comes to something as vital as our cardiovascular system.
So perhaps we need to start thinking about our hearing health, not just as something that affects our ears, but as something that could have broader implications for our overall well-being, even our heart health.
It definitely makes you wonder if we should be incorporating hearing assessments into routine health checkups as a way to potentially identify those who might be at higher risk for not just hearing loss, but also for cardiovascular issues down the line.
Food for thought. And something for all of us to consider as we think about how to best protect both our physical and mental health for the long haul. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.
See you then.